There's been a lot of talk in the media about asparagus in the last couple of weeks. It's moving towards the end of April now, and the great British crop. And we're in what we call a hungry gap. It's one of the first crops that comes in the garden and on the farm to feed a British market. It's early, and it's of course a great luxury, or at least that's the label it's been given. I allot quite a lot of room to it. I've got 4 beds in this garden because I love the stuff, and it's great to feed a lot of people or give it away to friends. And it comes at a time of year when, although there's a lot to do in the garden, there isn't an overwhelming amount of stuff happening all at once. So there's time to get on the bed, the weeds haven't really started to grow. It's a good time to be able to focus on asparagus. It's ready for harvest. I've been eating it for a couple of weeks now. It's absolutely delicious, but I have to spend some time working on these beds. So this is the moment. It's got a little gentle covering of weed. And the thing with asparagus, it's a bit like onions or garlic. It's a monocot in its, what we call a monocot in its juvenile form, in that it's a single spear coming up, and it really doesn't like competition from weeds, especially perennial weeds. Being a perennial crop, this great big body of root is under the soil about a foot down. And if the perennial weeds get tangled up with that, there's no way you ever get them out. So if they germinate on the surface, the small ones like the dandelions or the creeping buttercup, this is the moment to get them out. If they've become established in the crown, it's too late and it doesn't matter. It won't affect the crop, but they've got to come out. And that way, when I stop cutting this asparagus at the end of its season, which is always in the middle of June, when you stop cutting, you let the fern grow up, which can then take energy back down into the plant. When that fern grows up, you can't get at the weed. It's all higgledy-piggledy. There's fern falling everywhere. It's wet, there's dew. It's a nightmare job. Here, the bed is clear. All there are the spears, and a few leftover bits of wood from last year's asparagus. It's a great time to get on the bed and weed it. So that's what I'm doing, and I'm looking around and seeing all kinds of things that I really don't want here, bits of grass, and there's a beautiful but very invasive little red oxalis, which is a little tuberous weed, which is very persistent. Got to get rid of that, because if that gets a hold, it'll just cover the whole bed. The little green annual weed is chamomile. Need to definitely get rid of that. There's this creeping buttercup that I mentioned, an easy weed to get out, but a very, again, invasive and persistent perennial creeping weed with thick, fleshy roots that takes a good strong hold. And there's little bits of plantain and some poppies, and all these things come from my compost heap. Most autumns I try and cover these asparagus beds with seaweed, because we're only 15 miles from the coast. And if I can get it together to pack the car up with seaweed, I'll do that. Otherwise, I give the bed a feed of compost every late autumn, early winter. And with that come weed seeds, because I cold compost, I don't hot compost, I just pile everything onto my compost heap for month after month after month, and finally in the winter I give it a big old turn, and then it's ready in the spring. And because it never heats up and cooks up, then it won't kill the weed seeds. So they come from here, and if I go very carefully with my fork or my fingers around the crowns, and I don't go digging in with my fork, then it's labour intensive, sure, but it's got to be done. There's no other way around it. And at the same time, I'm taking off the little bits of broken. I mean, there's this thing that a lot of people are very fussy about asparagus and say, well, you mustn't go sticking your fork in, you mustn't go interrupting it. Well, that's true, but at the same time, the worst you'll do is break a spear off. You're not, unless you put a shovel or a fork down into this, you're not going to interfere with the crown. It's a foot underground. You break some spears off that are coming through, definitely, but you know what? That's the worst you'll do. So I do try and do this every year. Really do it, because, as I say, that when the summer goes on and the fern starts to grow, you won't have a chance to get at it. So this is the moment, in the nice, warm spring weather, dig all these weeds up, just gently. I mean, I'm only putting the fork in an inch under the soil at max and just lifting it up. And sometimes I take them away, sometimes I just chuck them in the path and the sun will burn off the roots, especially on a day like today. Tend to do this on dry days. But my bed is roughly 3 foot wide. All the beds in this garden are 3 foot wide. And I do all the work from the path, and that's how I do it. So that's my job for today, weeding the asparagus bed, and I'll reward myself with a big dinner of fresh asparagus tonight.